In this video, I'm going to show you how to sew the Why'd You Do That Trousers sewing pattern. You can purchase the pattern at forestandthread.com. It is a PDF pattern available for immediate download. The video will start with the sewing steps, so go ahead and prep your fabric and pattern before watching the video. The Why'd You Do That Trousers sewing pattern offers 6 different views. In this video, I'm going to go back and forth between view A and view D. This follows the sewing pattern instructions in the same exact order. There are timestamps to help you bounce around more easily to each step. This pattern includes how to sew a Hong Kong seam finish. This is how I choose to finish the seams within the video. You can always choose to just use an overlock or a regular home sewing machine to finish your seams. So go ahead and skip those steps if they're not relevant to you. Oh, and last thing, I was really sick for parts of this video, so I'm really sorry for how awfully sick I sound in it. I hope that doesn't take away from your ability to learn how to sew these pants. Okay, thank you so much, and let me know if you have any questions. I would be happy to help and explain further. Happy sewing! The Why'd You Do That Trousers sewing pattern includes instructions for how to sew your seams with a Hong Kong seam finish. If you would like to use this seam finish, it is highly recommended to make continuous bias tape. To start, you need to cut a square out of your lining material. Once you have your square cut, you're going to mark the halfway point on 2 opposite ends of the square. Then you are going to cut a diagonal line from one corner to the other. Flip one triangle to be right side facing the other triangle and match your halfway point marks. Pin these edges together. Sew along your pinned edge with a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. Trim your seam allowance down to 1/8 or 3mm. Press your seam allowance in one direction. On the wrong side of your fabric, you're going to draw 1-inch parallel lines across the entire piece. Flip your piece to be right side up. Bring the edges that each have the end of your lines that you just drew together. Right now, the top edge matches perfectly, and each line matches across the raw edges. What you want to do in order to make it continuous bias tape is you need to offset the lines by 1. So I'm going to shift this piece up by 1 so that one line is going to be above the top edge of the other piece. And then the following lines will match, being offset by 1 at the top. And then it will be offset by 1 at the bottom as well. Bring your pieces to be right side facing so you can pin the raw edges together. Keeping it offset by 1. So this will stick up. I'll match this line to this line. And I'm going to pin it down the entire edge. This last piece is kind of sticking out over the end. That's because you offset it by 1, so it's still offset by 1 at the bottom. So if you put it into a perfect tube, it kind of looks like this. So you have this line connected with the bottom edge here, and you have this top line connected with the top edge here. And then you should see lines connecting across. Sew along your pinned edge with a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Trim your seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters. I find it helpful to use a sleeve board for this part. You have a complete tube right now. So if you want to press the seam allowance in one direction, it's helpful to have it in a single layer like this around the sleeve board. If you used a marking tool that disappears with steam or with pressing, you may want to skip this step. It might be easier for the next step that you have your markings and they didn't disappear with the steam or pressing. Now we're ready to cut out our bias tape. So starting at one end where you have an offset piece, you're going to start cutting along your 1-inch lines. I sometimes keep mine on my sleeve board because that gives me an easy way to just continuously turn this in a spiral. Usually you're left with a little tiny strip, something like this, that's not even with the rest of your bias tape. So I just trim that off. Wrap your bias tape around spare cardboard or something to keep it neat and tidy so that you have it ready for sewing during the process. And we're done. Mark your notches according to your personal size or the notches that refer to all sizes. Make sure to mark both fabric pieces. When the pattern piece says to cut 2, flip your pattern piece so that you mirror the first pattern piece and mark your notches again. Apply your fusible interfacing by laying your fabric piece face down and lay your fusible interfacing piece glue side down on top of the wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to use a press cloth because I find that this specific fusible interfacing gets a little sticky, even if the glue side is face down. This is a medium weight weft interfacing, which is a good recommended weight for this pattern. Use the appropriate iron settings for your specific fabric. For waistband views, you will need to apply fusible interfacing to the waistband pieces. This is views A, B, and C. If you have a fabric that looks the same from the front and back, just make sure that you have 2 mirrored pieces. So you can see that the waistband piece goes slightly up at one end and it's straight on this end. So just make sure that they're mirroring each other. Place the fusible interfacing with the glue side down and then press it in place. If you're using a really heavy fabric as your self fabric, You may choose to only apply fusible interfacing to one of your waistband layers. Now I'm going to repeat the same thing for the number 3 left waistband with extension pattern piece. So again, make sure that you have 2 mirrored pieces. If you're making a view with a waist facing, which is view D, E, or F, you're going to need to make sure that you adhere the interfacing for the waist facing pieces to your self fabric. And then just repeat this for each of the waist facing pieces, which is number 11, number 12, and number 13. If you're making a view that has a welt pocket, you're going to need to apply your fusible interfacing to your welt pocket pieces. So this is for view C or D. The pattern is going to tell you to cut 2 pieces of your self fabric and 2 pieces of interfacing. You're only going to need to apply 1 fusible interfacing piece to one of your self fabric pieces for right now. Later on in the pattern, when you get to the welt pocket sewing steps, you'll be instructed what to use these extra 2 pieces for. So just set them aside for now, and you're going to apply your fusible interfacing with the glue side down, just like the other pieces. And same thing for both welt pocket sizes, whether you're using the small or the large, you only need to do it for 1 piece right now. For views with the slash pocket, which are views A and F, you're going to want to apply fusible interfacing to your number 7 pocket facing pieces. With the wrong side facing up of your number 1 front pieces, you're going to transfer the markings from your paper pattern for the pleat onto the wrong side of your fabric. You can see how my notches have been cut out here. I like to use a notch cutter. It makes it a lot easier to transfer markings, especially notches. And down here, the end of the pleat, there are little punched out holes. I like to use a screw punch to punch out the corners so that it's easier to mark within the pattern. Otherwise, you can just use a pen and mark where the pen hits. So mark the 3 notches at the top and the bottom corner circles. And then you're going to use a straight edge to draw a straight line from your furthest notch straight down to your marked circle. And again, with your notch closest to the center front, draw a straight line down to your other circle. And we'll repeat that process for your second front piece. So you're going to need to flip your pattern to be face down. You're going to stay stitch the top edge of your front pieces. I'm using about a 1/8 inch or 3 millimeter seam allowance and just sewing a straight stitch to stop any unwanted stretching throughout the sewing process. And repeat for your second front piece. With right sides facing, we're going to pin our straight lines together to create our pleat. Sew along your drawn line where you just pinned. And make sure to backstitch at the bottom because there might be extra strain while you're wearing these pants at that point. Press your pleat away from the center front edge. Now is a good time to press your pleat all the way down the front leg piece if you wish to. If you do press it all the way down to the hem, this is going to give a really crisp, clean line while you're wearing your pants. You may have to press it again after washing and wearing, but at least this gives you a guide at an easier point rather than later on when your pants are totally finished. With the right side of your front facing up, sew an edge stitch along the pleat line. If you wish to, you could use top stitching thread for this part, since it's a visible stitch detail. I'm going to put a pin where the pleat ends so that I know where to stop my stitch. And again, make sure you backstitch here. Now we're going to sew a straight stitch to secure the pleat in place for the rest of the sewing construction. So again, with roughly 1/8 inch or 3 millimeters seam allowance, just sew your pleat in place along the top edge of your front piece. With the right side facing down of your back piece, you're going to transfer the dart markings onto the wrong side of your fabric. So I'm transferring the 2 legs at the top edge of my back piece, and then I'm going to transfer both points of the dart. My pattern has been cut out so that it's easier to transfer the markings. And then I'm going to use a straight edge to connect the first dot to the top edge. And then a straight line to connect these 2 dots. The reason for this is that when I sew it, so I'm going to sew it like this, I'm going to sew a straight line here and then just gently curve it and taper it off to the bottom dot. So I don't really need to draw in the curve. If you want to, you can, but I'm just going to gently ease it to the bottom dot and transfer the dart markings to your second back piece. Don't forget to flip your pattern with right sides facing. Pin your dart legs together. I'm just going to make sure that the straight line connecting the bottom 2 dots is on the very edge of the fold. Sew your darts from the top edge of your back piece along the lines that you drew. When you get to the top dot, gently curve and sew along the folded edge until the bottom dot, and then sew off of your fabric. And leave your threads long so that you can tie a double knot. And then trim your thread. If you have a tailor's ham, now's a good time to grab it, to press your darts, lay your back piece over the tailor's ham, or maybe a rolled up towel, something to give you a bit of a soft curve. And you're going to press the dart away from the center back edge, which is away from the curved rise. Sew your dart in place along the top edge by sewing a straight stitch using 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeter seam allowance. For views with a slash pocket, which are views A and F, You will want to follow these steps. Finish the curved edge of your pocket backing with a serger or a regular home sewing machine. Give your finished edge a little press, just to flatten it out. With wrong sides together, pin your pocket backing to your pocket stay. Match notches at the top edge and notches at the side edge, and pin in place. Sew your pocket backing in place using about a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Sew around all 3 edges of your pocket backing to secure it to your pocket stay lining piece. Finish the curved edge of your pocket facing pieces. Give your finished edge a little press just to flatten it out. With wrong sides together, pin your pocket facing to your pocket bag front along the cut/slash line. This is the pocket opening edge. So match that edge together, match the top edge together, and match the side edge together, and then pin in place. Secure your pocket facing to your pocket bag front lining piece using a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Sew around all 4 edges of your pocket facing piece. Finish the straight edge of your pocket bag front piece. Bring your pocket bag front lining piece to the right side of your front leg piece. The pocket facing side of your pocket bag front lining piece should be face down. The lining is going to be right side up, but the pocket facing is going to be right sides together with the front leg piece. And then you're going to pin together along the straight pocket opening edge. Sew along the pocket opening edge with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Trim down your seam allowance of your pocket bag front lining piece only, just outside of the previous 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Press your seam allowance towards your pocket bag front lining. With the right side of your front leg piece and pocket facing up, sew an understitch. This is basically an edge stitch along the seam line, making sure to stitch on top of your seam allowance. Fold your pocket bag front piece towards the wrong side of your front leg piece and press your pocket opening edge. The seam will naturally roll slightly towards the inside because of the understitch. Here's how it looks from the outside and the inside. Bring your front leg piece to your pocket backing and pocket stay. The top edge of your pocket opening edge is going to match the notch on the top edge of your pocket backing, and the rest of the top edge of your front leg should match the rest of your pocket stay edge. And the center front edge is going to line up as well. The bottom notch on your pocket backing should be 1/2 inch away from your pocket opening edge. Once you've matched your top notch and your side notch to 1/2 inch out, pin your pocket opening edge to your pocket backing / pocket stay piece. Carefully fold back your front leg piece so that you can see your pocket bag front lining piece. Your pocket bag front lining piece should be 1/2 inch beyond the notch at the top edge of your pocket stay and the notch at the bottom edge of your pocket stay. Once it's aligned, pin the straight edge to the pocket stay in place. Sew your pocket bag lining piece to your pocket stay along the straight edge with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Sew along the bottom curved edge of your pocket bag front and pocket stay with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Just until you get to the straight edge of your pocket bag front piece. Finish the bottom curved edge of your pocket stay and the pocket bag front piece. Give the bottom edge of your pocket lining and pocket stay a press, especially if it is a bit wavy like mine is. The reason it might get a bit wavy looking at the bottom edge of your pocket stay is because the curves create a bit of bias, so it can easily be pulled as you're sewing and finishing the edge. Okay, once it's nice and flat, unfold your front leg piece and bring it over your pocket stay into place. Once you have the top edges lined up and the center front edge lined up and the side edge lined up, pin all of these edges into place. Here is what the inside looks like now. So the pocket stay matches along the center front edge and the top edge and the side edge. And it should be pretty flat on the inside. Make sure that you don't force your pocket edge opening to fit perfectly into place. It's better if it's nice and flat and pulled taut. So if it needs to come up over the top edge a little bit, that's better than forcing it into place because that might cause some bubbling or gaping while you're wearing the pants. Sew your front leg piece to your pocket stay along the center front edge using a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. Continue attaching your front leg to your pocket stay along the top edge. Again, using a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. And again, attach your front leg to your pocket stay along the side edge using a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. Finish the curved edge of your fly piece. You can either choose to finish your curved edge with a Hong Kong seam finish or just with a regular serger or home sewing machine. I'm going to show you how to finish it with a Hong Kong seam finish. Take your bias tape and pin it face down along the curved edge. Sew your bias tape to your fly along the curved edge using a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. Trim the excess bias tape. Trim your seam allowance down to 1/8 or 3 millimeters. Press your bias tape away from your fly piece. Flip your fly piece to be face down. Fold your bias tape around the seam allowance and press it along the folded edge. Now you're going to sew a stitch in the ditch along the bias tape. So with your right side facing up of your fly piece, sew directly in the seam of your bias tape and fly piece. This stitch line will catch the raw edge of your bias tape on the underside of your fly piece. Fold your shield piece in half lengthwise with right sides together and pin along one of the short ends. Sew along your pinned edge with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Trim your seam allowance to 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. Flip your shield piece to be right side out and press the seam to be directly on the edge and your piece to be perfectly folded in half with raw edges along the long side together. With the folded edge of your shield on the left-hand side, place your zipper on top of your shield. Line up the start of the zipper 5/8 of an inch below the top edge. Line up the zipper tape 1/4 of an inch in from the right side. Then pin your zipper tape in place, just the right side of your zipper. Sew your zipper tape in place using 1/2 inch or a 13 millimeter seam allowance. Place your shield piece zipper face down along the center front edge of your left front leg piece. Pin your shield in place, matching the top edge and the center front edge. Sew your shield to your front leg along the pinned edge using 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Place your fly piece face down on top of your right front leg piece. Right sides should be together. Match the fly piece to the top edge and the center front edge and pin in place. Sew your fly piece in place using 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Trim only your fly piece seam allowance down to 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. Finish your front rise on the right front leg piece with either an overlock stitch or a Hong Kong seam finish. I'm going to show you how to do a Hong Kong seam finish. You only need to finish from about 1 inch above the bottom of your fly to the very bottom of your front rise. If you're doing an overlock stitch, you can finish the entire rise because it will probably be easier. Pin your bias tape along the bottom portion of your front rise with right side facing down. So right sides are together with your front leg piece and your bias tape. And I'm just going to trim my bias tape now because it will be easier. Sew your bias tape in place with a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Trim your seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters, only along the bias tape. Press your bias tape away from your front leg. Flip your front leg piece to be face down. Fold your bias tape around to the underside of your front leg piece, wrapping your seam allowance. Press your bias tape along the folded edge. With the right side of your front leg facing up, stitch in the ditch along the seam of your bias tape. With the right side facing up of your front piece, fold your fly away from your front piece and press. Your seam allowance should be going towards the fly piece. Sew an edge stitch along your fly front seam. Mark 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters up from the bottom of your fly along the seam allowance on the wrong side of your front leg. If you used a Hong Kong seam finish along the front rise, this should be about where your Hong Kong seam finish ended. On your left front leg, we're going to finish the front rise. You can either finish it with a Hong Kong seam finish or an overlock stitch. I'm going to show you how to finish it with a Hong Kong seam finish. Pin your bias tape face down along the front rise. Sew your bias tape to your front rise with a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Your fly piece should be sandwiched in between your bias tape and your front leg. Trim your excess bias tape. Trim your seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters. Press your bias tape away from your front leg. Flip your front leg piece to be face down and wrap your bias tape around the seam allowance. Press your bias tape along the folded edge. With the right side of your front piece facing up, stitch in the ditch along your bias tape seam. Press your shield and zipper away from your front piece. Your seam allowance and finished seam will be pushed towards your front piece. Sew an edge stitch along your shield seam. Now is a good time to trim your zipper length if you left it extra long, like I have. Bring your two front pieces together, right sides facing, along the bottom portion of the front rise. Your fly and shield piece should be coming away from your front pieces. Pin along the bottom portion of your front rise. The seam allowance on your shield piece is going to be forced to be pushed towards the front leg because of the edge stitch. We're going to force it to come the other direction. So hold that there and then flip back around. And we want to position the fly seam to be 1/8 of an inch towards the right-hand side of the shield seam. So I'm just going to position it slightly off, just 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters towards the right side, and pin that there. And I'm still holding the seam allowance to be towards the shield, and I'm going to pin it just like this. This is that previous 1 inch or 2.5 centimeter mark that we made, so just pin up until that mark. So here's how it looks from this side, and here is how it looks from the back side. So the seam allowance is being forced this direction. And we're just going to sew along here up until here with this side facing up. Sew the bottom portion of your front rise with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Only sew up until your 1 inch or 2.5 centimeter mark that you made above the bottom of the fly piece. And then press your seam allowance open, and here is how we are looking from the front right now. The front fly is almost finished. You can see how it's all coming together, and we have a nice clean center front line. Fold your fly piece to the back side of your front leg and press your center front edge. Align your center front edge with your fly 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters to the right of your seam with the shield. So bringing it in a straight line to the top edge, and pin it in place. Now flip your garment to be wrong side up and fold your shield away from the zipper so that you can see the second edge of your zipper tape exposed with your fly, and pin it out of the way. Now grab your fly and zipper tape and move your front leg piece out of the way so that you just have your fly and your zipper tape exposed. And now pin your zipper tape to your fly. Sew your zipper tape to your front fly using a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Go ahead and place your front leg pieces right side face up. We are going to finish the fly piece with a top stitch. This is only for views A, B, and C, which are views with a waistband. If you are sewing views D, E, and F, which are views with a waist facing, skip ahead. This step is going to be finished later during the waist facing installation. So grab your fly pattern piece and draw in the seam allowance on the curved edge and the straight edge. It's 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters. Then the easiest way to do this is actually cut away the seam allowance. I like to leave just a small portion at the top connected so that I can just tape it back together and use the pattern piece again for a later garment. And then just fold this seam allowance out of the way. And then you can place this face down in line with the folded center front edge in order to draw the fly curve, which we are going to stitch. So grab your preferred marking tool and trace the fly curve onto the right side of your fabric. Make sure your shield piece is still pinned out of the way, and with your right side facing up, pin your fly piece along the stitch line that you just drew out. You want to make sure that your fly piece is flat and the folded edge is still pinned in place. And you are just pinning one layer of your front leg piece and the fly piece. And the pocket lining is sandwiched in between. So here's how we look from the front. And here's how we look from the back. With the right side of your garment facing up, sew along the sketched in fly curve. If you are using top stitching thread for the exposed stitch lines, this is one of the stitch lines that you'll want to switch to your top stitching thread. Go ahead and unpin your shield piece now and place it over your fly where it naturally wants to go. Now we are going to sew this little corner in place, but from the right side. So turn your garment to be right side facing up and find where the corner overlaps. You can feel it through your fabric. It should be right at the little corner down here. I'm just going to pin this in place. I'm just going to sew a few stitches back and forth right in between these two pins where the corner of the shield is beneath the fly. If you would prefer, you can sew a bar tack. And now you've finished your front fly zipper. Here's the little stitch mark that we made just now. With right sides facing, pin your back pieces together along the center back rise. Sew your back rise with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Now we are going to finish the back rise seam allowance. You can either choose to sew it with a Hong Kong seam finish or an overlock stitch. If you're going to sew with an overlock stitch, then just sew both layers together along the entire back rise. I'm going to show you how to finish it with a Hong Kong seam finish. To do so, first we're going to press the seam allowance open. Since it's a curved seam, I'm placing my tailor's ham beneath so that it's easier to press. Now we'll finish each seam edge separately with a Hong Kong seam finish. So grab your bias tape and pin it to one edge, right side facing down. Sew your bias tape to your seam allowance where you just pinned using a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. Go ahead and trim your bias tape at the edge of your seam, and now trim your seam allowance down to 1/8 inch or 3mm. Press your bias tape away from the seam. Now flip your piece so that the bottom of the seam is facing up so that you can wrap the bias tape around your seam allowance and then press your bias tape to stay wrapped around the seam allowance. With the right side of your seam facing up, you're going to stitch in the ditch along the bias tape seam. And this is your finished Hong Kong seam. Now we need to finish the second side of the seam allowance. Press your seam allowances open again. Again, I'm going to use my tailor's ham for the bottom portion of the back rise where it's curved. And I'm going to press the seam allowance open. And now you have a beautifully finished Hong Kong seam. Bring your back and front leg pieces together, right sides facing. We are going to pin along these side seams. So match the top edge and the side edge and pin together. There's a notch along the side seam around the low hip. Match the notches from the front to the back. And make your way down to the hem. And now I'm going to pin the other side seam as well. I'm going to flip it around because I like to start pinning at the top edge and make my way to the hem. Sew your side seams together using 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. And sew the second side seam as well. Now you can either finish your side seam edges with an overlock stitch or a Hong Kong seam finish. If you're going to sew it with an overlock stitch, just sew both layers together and press your seams towards the back. I'm going to show you how to sew it with a Hong Kong seam finish. So first we're going to press our seam allowances open. I'm going to use a tailor's ham underneath the hip area since it's curved. Starting with one side of your seam allowance, bring your bias tape face down on top of the seam allowance and pin the edges together. Sew your bias tape to your seam allowance using a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. Trim your excess bias tape and trim your seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch or 3mm. Now press your bias tape away from your seam allowance. Flip your piece so the underside of your seam allowance is facing up and wrap the bias tape around to the back side of your seam allowance. And press the bias tape in place along the folded edge. With the right side of your seam allowance facing up, you're going to stitch in the ditch along the bias tape seam. Now we're going to finish the second side of your side seam. Give your finished Hong Kong seams a final press. I'm using my tailor's ham below the hip area, and I'm pressing the seams open. And this side seam is now finished. Repeat this method for the second side seam. Here is the finished second side seam with a Hong Kong seam finish. Now both of your side seams should be completely finished and pressed open. If you're sewing a view with a welt pocket, which is view C or D, the following steps show you how to do the welt pocket construction. Here we have your number 14 welt pocket small pattern piece and your number 15 welt pocket large pattern piece. You might be choosing to do 2 of the small or 2 of the large or any combination you'd like. Despite whichever one you choose, the construction method is going to be the same. The only change is going to be where it's placed onto your front or back leg. So we're going to trace this box onto the wrong side of the fabric piece that has already had the interfacing applied to the back side. So you want to trace the box onto the interfaced side. I like to use a screw punch to punch out the corners of my square so that it's easy to mark onto my fabric. This is what a screw punch looks like. It's really helpful because then you can mark within a pattern piece very easily because you just go like this, and then there's a hole there that you can use your tracing tool to trace through. So I'm just gonna mark the corners. And then I'm going to use a ruler to draw in the rectangle. The rectangle should be 1/2 inch tall or 13 millimeters. And then you want to mark the center line, which should be 1/4 inch above the bottom horizontal line, 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. Repeat the same method for the welt pocket large piece. So I'm going to show you how to mark the corners if you don't have a screw punch. So you would just use pins to mark the corners of the rectangle. I like to put all 4 pins in at the same time, so then you make sure you have the right placement, and then you just pull back the paper pattern and mark where the pin is hitting. And then I'll just remove each pin as I do it. Both the welt pocket small and the welt pocket large pieces have a 1/2 inch tall rectangle, 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters. Okay, so you probably marked your front and back pieces where the welt pocket should go at the beginning after cutting your fabric, but since I used a marking tool that disappears with steam, I only have a faint guide here of one of the corners. So I'm going to use my paper pattern and remark the positioning for the welt pocket. So here's my front pattern piece. I just drew in the 1/2 inch seam allowance along the side seam, and that's probably all you have to do in order to get the placement. So here's my side seam, and then just line this up. The notch here lines up with the pleat and the edge stitch at the top. So then mark your 4 corners. This is for the small welt pocket piece. And you can see I am marking on the right side of my fabric, on the right side of my front leg. So for this leg, I need to flip my pattern piece to be face down to match. So I'm just matching the top notch with the edge stitch here. And then up here is my seam allowance. So I'm just folding that back a bit and lining those up along the top edge so I can get the correct positioning. So then here's my welt pocket, the large welt pocket markings for the front leg. So I'm just gonna mark those 2 dots. Again, if you don't have a screw punch, trace the welt pocket markings onto the back side of your leg, unless you're doing it on the other leg and then your pattern piece is face up, which is great. Same thing for the back leg, except this time the pattern piece is gonna be face up. So I'm just going to flip my pant. So then just mark these 2 dots, fairly close to where it originally was. So you're gonna turn your pant wrong side out so that you can apply the spare interfacing piece to the inside of your pant. So this is the extra interfacing piece cut from my 14 welt pocket small, and I'm going to use this to reinforce where we're going to put the welt pocket. So you can see here's where I marked my welt pocket small on the front. So I'm going to line up on the back, on the inside, directly behind that and apply the interfacing there. You can see how I'm not including the seam allowance under the Fusible here. Let that just stay free. So then To do the large welt pocket placement, you need to expose the side seam like this. So here's the front of the welt pocket placement, and here's the back. And here's my spare interfacing piece from the number 15 welt pocket large pattern piece. So just making sure everything's really smooth. This is on a curve, so if you need to, you can use an ironing ham to help along the side seam. And see, I'm keeping my side seam pressed open like this, and I'm just gonna go straight over the hong seam finish. We're going to line up the welt pocket piece directly over the markings that you made on your front leg. So the 4 corners need to match the 4 dots that you marked. So I'm going to use a pin, go through the corner, and grab the dot. I'm just going to leave it loose until I grab all 4 corners. It's lined up with all 4 corners now, so I'm going to pin it in place. You're going to be sewing around this box, so it would be helpful to put the pins away from the marked box so that you can sew with the pin still holding your welt pocket piece in place. And we're going to repeat for the welt pocket large. This does go over a curve, but you do want to make sure that this is as flat as possible. So if you need to move it slightly to flatten it, that's better than trying to keep it perfectly placed. And you can see I'm only pinning through one layer, not both legs. Be careful of that. So this is pinned in place. Here's the inside view. And same with the small welt pocket inside view. And now we're ready to go to the sewing machine. So this is a little tricky because you have the rest of your pant, so just make sure that nothing's caught underneath and you're only sewing through the front leg and the welt pocket piece. So with the box facing up, you're going to follow along the box line. So I just am starting in this one corner. It might be helpful to walk your needle to make sure that you hit the corners accurately. Then you're going to pivot your needle at the short end. And then pivot your needle again to go down the long side at the bottom. And then I'm gonna rotate my pant all the way around so that it's easier. And sew the last short side until you meet where you started. And backstitch. And we're going to repeat for the welt pocket large. So now we're going to cut open our welt pocket along the center line. If you have a buttonhole cutter, you can use that to start your opening, but I don't, so I'm going to use my little thread scissors so that I can be as precise as possible and make sure you're only cutting through the layer that you want to cut through, which is your front leg and your welt pocket piece. So just in the center along the line, I'm going to make a little snip. Okay, there we go. And now I'm going to use my fabric scissors to cut along the remaining part of this line down to the bottom edge, about 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters before the very edge. And then I'm going to cut diagonally so that I create that little triangle at the end. So go as close as possible to your thread line without cutting over your stitches. Just like that. And this is the welt pocket small, and so this placement, I just cut into my pleat layer. And then going down the other side. Okay, there we go. And now the large one. So again, using my thread scissors to just make a little snip. You can see I'm holding my layers to make sure I'm not cutting through anything I don't want to. So I turned my pant wrong side out again, and now I am going to take the welt pocket piece and fold it through the opening into the inside. I'm just going to place a tailor's ham underneath so that I can iron just this layer. So first you're going to press this little seam allowance up towards the center. And then you're going to repeat that on the top edge as well and press the seam allowance towards the center. And then you want to fold back your welt pocket piece over the seam allowance like this, without forcing your seam allowance to go up, but you want to cover it like this. And then press that in place. And then repeat the same thing for the other long side. So fold your welt pocket piece over the seam allowance. They should meet in the middle. And press it in place. And from the right side of your pants, you can see the welt pocket is starting to form. So then if you just pull back these little pieces, you're gonna see the little triangle here. So you're gonna pin the triangle to the rest of the welt pocket piece here, with everything folded in place like this. And do that on the other end as well. So peel this back to see the little triangle. And we'll repeat these steps on the large welt pocket. And the welt pocket is going to start to appear from the right side of your pant. There we go. So with just your welt pocket piece and the triangle being caught under the needle, we are going to sew along the base of the triangle, basically exactly over where your previous stitch line was. Here's what it looks from the other side. So you sewed along the base of the triangle, and then you're going to have a little stitch line here on the other side of your welt pocket piece. We will repeat for the other triangle end. And again for the other welt pocket. You should now have 2 little stitch lines on the back side of your welt pocket, just like this. And the front will look like a welt. And the same on your large welt pocket. 2 little stitch lines on the back. And the front looks like this. So now grab your spare welt pocket large and welt pocket small piece that was cut in your self fabric that did not have the fusible interfacing, and we're going to finish one of the long edges of the rectangle. This is going to become our pocket facing. So just pick one edge that will be the bottom edge of your pocket facing and finish it with your serger or your regular sewing machine. Now you're going to grab your pocket lining piece and you're going to bring your pocket facing to the top edge, which is going to be one of your shorter ends. With the right side facing up of your lining, you're going to pin your pocket facing along the top 3 edges with your finished edge at the bottom. And we're going to repeat that with our large welt pocket piece. So now we're going to sew the pocket facing in place using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just go around all 4 edges of your pocket facing and attach it to the lining fabric. I'm going to repeat this for my large welt pocket piece. With the inside of your pants facing out, you're going to bring your welt pocket lining piece to the welt pocket piece. The right side of your lining should be face down. The facing should be at the opposite end, and you're going to match these edges. So it's the bottom edge of your welt pocket piece with the bottom edge of your lining piece. And the right side of your lining is face down. And you're going to pin these 2 layers together, but don't pin through your leg at all, just pin the welt pocket piece and the welt pocket lining piece. And I'm going to repeat this on my large welt pocket. Sewing just through the welt pocket layer and the lining layer, you're going to use a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance and sew these two layers together. And repeat on your second welt pocket. You're going to finish the edges on the seam that you just sewed. So again, only sewing through the lining layer and the welt pocket layer. Use your serger or your regular machine to finish the edges. And repeat on your other welt pocket. I'm going to press the seam allowance and the lining layer down away from the welt pocket opening. And I'll repeat this on my second welt pocket. An optional sewing step is adding a button and a buttonhole to your welt pocket. I would suggest adding it for the large welt pocket because it's quite long, so while you're wearing it, it might droop a little bit, especially if you put something in the pocket bag. So to do so, we're going to measure the center point along the bottom edge and measure 3/8 inch down from that bottom point, 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter. So this is a 10-inch welt pocket. This is the size 22 from the D block size range. The B block size range, the large welt pocket, is slightly smaller. So for 10 inches, halfway across is 5. And so 3/8 inch down from 5 is here. So this is where I'm going to start my buttonhole. And I'm just going to mark a vertical line down that's perpendicular to the welt pocket horizontal line. To sew your buttonhole, you're going to only sew through your self fabric and your lining fabric. So bring your buttonhole marking, the placement, directly under your needle, and sew your buttonhole according to your personal sewing machine's instructions. I like to go around my buttonhole 2 or 3 times because my machine doesn't sew the stitches quite so dense, so I like to reinforce it a couple times. There we go. There is an optional top stitching detail along the welt pockets, specifically for the large welt pocket, but I'm going to show you how you sew it for the large welt pocket as well as the small welt pocket. So if you want to, you can switch your thread to a top stitching weight. I'm going to put in a Mara 30 top stitching thread. Okay, I'm using a top stitching thread on my needle side, but on the bobbin side I'm using regular thread weight. And I'm going to lengthen my stitch to a 3.5, and I was using a 2.5. And I'm starting about 1/8 of an inch above the short end of my welt pocket. So it's going to stick out about 1/8 of an inch. And then I'm sewing along the bottom edge of my welt pocket. And when you get to the other short end, go about 1/8 of an inch beyond the short end so that it sticks out a little bit. So for your small welt pocket, if you want to do a top stitching detail, you'll do the same thing as with the large welt pocket, and you'll sew the bottom line now before finishing the pocket bag. With the wrong side of your pants facing out, you're going to fold your lining right sides together and bring the pocket facing up to the top edge of your welt pocket piece. And you're going to pin these 2 layers together, making sure not to pin through your pant legs at all. And I'll repeat this on my second welt pocket. If you did the optional top stitch detail, make sure to put your regular thread back into your machine and make sure to set your stitch length back to what you had previously. For me, it was 2.5. Now you're going to sew along this edge with a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. Make sure to only sew the welt pocket piece and the lining. Repeat on your second welt pocket. Now you're going to finish the edge of the seam that you just sewed. I'm going to use my serger, or you can use your regular sewing machine, and I'm going to repeat the same thing for my second welt pocket. You're going to press the seam that you just finished up away from your pocket bag. And this is what it should look like from the right side of your fabric. You see the pocket facing through the opening. And again, I'm going to press the seam flat away from the pocket bag. Starting at the top edge, you're going to pin the sides of your pocket bag together and work your way down to the folded edge. You can see on the underside that the welt pocket piece is still folded. You don't need to try and flatten that. Keep that folded just as it is. And I'm going to repeat these steps on my second welt pocket. Make sure that your front and back legs are folded out of the way, and you're just going to sew your pocket bag lining edges with a 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance, starting at the top edge and working your way down to the folded edge. And sew your second side. And again for my second welt pocket. Now I'm going to finish the edges of the pocket bag where we just sewed our seam with either your serger or your regular sewing machine. And I'll do the same for my second pocket bag. This is what the finished pocket bag lining should look like. There's a folded edge at the bottom and it's finished along the upper 3 edges. And now I'm going to turn the pants right side out, and I'm going to give this a nice final press. If you chose to do the optional buttonhole and button, then go ahead and open your buttonhole. If you have a buttonhole cutter, use that. I'm just going to use my seam ripper and a pin to stop my seam ripper from ripping open the buttonhole. Then you're going to use your buttonhole to guide your placement for the button. So I'm just going to use my needle and thread, stick the needle through the top edge of the buttonhole, and use that as my placement. And then only sewing through the pocket facing and lining. This is where I'm going to sew the button. And there you go. If you are doing the optional top stitching detail across the large welt pocket, then you're going to want to take a ruler and a marking tool and draw a parallel vertical line to your edge stitch along your pleat, and it should be 2 inches to the right or the left, depending on what side of your pants you're doing your large welt pocket on. But you want it 2 inches towards the welt pocket. And so you're going to draw a vertical line. just about to the point that's going to be level with the top of your welt pocket. And then you're going to draw a horizontal line that continues the top edge of your welt pocket from your parallel line you just drew all the way to your back dart. And you're going to mark that horizontal line all the way to the back dart. And then you're going to use your back dart as the third line. And you can draw your top stitching line if you want to, or you can just use your back dart seam as your guide for the top stitching line. If you're using top stitching thread for your top stitching details, put back in your top stitching thread and change your stitch length to 3.5 or whatever stitch length you're using for your top stitch. Then following the line that you drew, you're going to start at the top of your front leg and sew the vertical line down. And when you get to the horizontal line, pivot your needle. Make sure nothing's caught underneath except for your welt pocket seam allowance. And then sew along your horizontal line that you drew and edge stitch along the top of your welt pocket. Sew along the horizontal line until you get to your back dart, and then you're going to pivot your needle. You're going to sew an edge stitch along your back dart. And to complete the top stitching around your welt, you're going to sew 2 vertical lines, edge stitching along the short ends of your welt. And I'm going to repeat on the second short end of my welt, and I'm walking my needle so that I can try and create the most perfect rectangle that I can. If you're doing a top stitch detail around your small welt pocket, then you're just going to continue the top stitch line around the upper 3 sides. So starting where you left off previously, I'm just going to line up my needle right where my previous stitch line ended and sew along the short end of my welt. And then pivot your needle and sew along an edge stitch along the top edge of your welt. And then pivot your needle again and meet back at the other end of your previous top stitch line. Bring your front rise and back rise together with right sides facing. Use a pin to perfectly match the seams. Pin together. Begin working your way down to the hem. Pin your front and back legs together with right sides facing along the inseam edges. Beginning at the rise again, work your way down to the hem along the other inseam edge. Sew your inseam together using 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Now you can choose how you would like to finish your inseam seam allowance. You can either sew with an overlock stitch along the entire inseam, sewing both layers together, and then press your seam towards the back, or you can finish either seam allowance edge separately with a Hong Kong seam finish. I'm going to use my sleeve board so that I feed my leg over the sleeve board in order to press the seam allowance open. Now I'm going to switch legs and press my second inseam seam allowances open. Starting at one of your hems with one side of your seam allowances, bring your bias tape face down along the raw edge and pin together. When you get to the front and back rise intersection, just continue straight over. And make your way down the second leg inseam. Starting at one hem, begin sewing your bias tape to your seam allowance with a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. When you get to the front and back rise intersection, just continue sewing straight over. And make your way down to the second hem. Trim your excess bias tape. Trim your seam allowance down to 1/8 or 3mm. Press your bias tape away from your seam allowance. Flip your seam so the back side of your seam allowance is facing up. Wrap your bias tape around towards the back side of your seam allowance and press it in place. Starting at one hem, stitch in the ditch along the bias tape seam with the right side of your seam allowance facing up. Now finish the second side of your seam allowance with a Hong Kong seam finish, following the same steps as before. I'm going to use my sleeve board to press the seam allowances open one last time now that I've finished both sides of the seam. Now all of your seams should be finished. The following steps will show you how to sew your waistband. Waistband views are view A, B, and C. If you are making views D, E, or F, skip to the following step. Bring one of your right waistband pieces to one of your left waistband with extension pieces. With right sides facing, match along the center back edge, which is the double notched edge. Pin your pieces together along this edge. Repeat this step for your second waistband pieces. Your left waistband with extension piece is longer than your right waistband. You want to make sure you have one left waistband with one right waistband. They should be mirroring each other. Sew your waistband pieces together along the center back edge where you just pinned with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Repeat for both pieces. Press your seam allowances open. The waistband piece with the left waistband width extension, which is marked by the notch on the bottom edge closest to the center front, the waistband piece with the left waistband width extension on the left-hand side while looking at it from the right side while it's making a smiley face shape, this piece will be your waistband and the other piece will be your waistband lining. Bring your two pieces together. You are going to pin these pieces together along the top edge. The top edge of this waistband, because it is shaped, the top edge is the edge that's at the top when your waistband looks like a smiley face. Starting at the center back, pin your two pieces together along the top edge, making sure to match the center back seams. Sew the top edge of your waistband pieces together using 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. With the waist lining piece facing up, which is when the left waistband width extension, which you know by the notch towards the center front, when that piece is on the left-hand side, then you know that the waist lining piece is facing up. We're going to grade our seam allowance from the waist lining piece only. Now flip your waist lining up so your waistband and your waist lining both are right side up. Press your seam allowance towards your waist lining piece. Make sure that you're sewing on top of your seam allowance side, so on top of your waist lining piece where you pressed your seam allowance towards. You're going to sew an understitch along the seam line. Fold your waistband pieces right sides out so that your seam is on the top edge. It will naturally roll slightly towards the lining side because of the understitch. Press the top edge. Bring your waistband layer to the top edge of your pants. The waistband layer is now recognizable because it is not the layer with the understitch. I'm going to start by matching the center back seams. With right sides together, pin your waistband layer only, leaving your waistband lining layer free. Pin your waistband layer to the top edge of your pants. Work your way to the center front edges. There's a notch on the bottom edge of your waistband indicating the side seam location. Match the notch to your side seam. When you get to the center front edge, you should have 1/2 inch of your waistband hanging over the center front edge. Now I'm going to make my way to the left center front edge, starting from the center back again. Again, match the notch on the bottom edge of your waistband to the side seam. And when you get to the left center front edge where your shield is, you should also have 1/2 inch of your waistband left over. Sew your waistband to the top edge of your pants using 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Now we are going to finish the raw edge of your waistband lining. You can choose to either finish it with an overlock stitch or your regular home machine, or do a Hong Kong seam finish. I'm going to show you how to do a Hong Kong seam finish. Bring your bias tape to the raw edge of your waistband lining, right sides together. Pin along the raw edge. Sew your bias tape along the raw edge of your waist lining with a 1/4 inch or 6 mm seam allowance. Trim your excess bias tape. Trim your seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch or 3 mm. Press your bias tape away from your waistband. Flip your seam to be wrong side facing up and fold your bias tape over to the wrong side of your seam. Press your bias tape along the fold. With the right side facing up of your waistband lining, stitch in the ditch along the seam of your bias tape. With right sides facing, fold your waistband lining towards your waistband along the center front edge. Keep the seam allowance on the inner side, folded upwards. On the waistband lining side, fold the bottom corner at a right angle. The folded edge should perfectly cross the intersection of the waistband seam and the top edge of your pants. Pin your waistband lining to your waistband, just like this, along the center front edge. The top edge of your waistband lining and waistband seam allowance will be forced to fold towards your waistband lining because of the understitch. Repeat this on the second center front edge. Sew along your pinned edge, attaching your waistband lining and waistband together. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13 mm seam allowance. Sew in a straight line to meet the center front edge of your pants. Repeat this process for your second center front edge. Grade your seam allowance by trimming off just the waistband layer. Repeat this for both seams. Grade your seam allowance along the bottom edge of your waistband as well. Do this by trimming off the pants layer only. Press your seam allowance at the bottom edge of your waistband up towards your waistband, away from your pants. Nicely fold the corner of your waistband and flip your waistband lining to be on the inside. Repeat this for the second corner of your waistband. Press the center front edge of your waistband so that the seam is directly on the edge. Repeat this for your second center front edge. Press the bottom edge of your waistband lining layer nice and flat in place. The waistband is finished with a hook and bar closure. If you prefer to sew on your hook and bars now while the waistband layer is still not attached so that you can reach inside, then you can skip ahead to the hook and bar section now. I prefer to finish the waistband lining and sew on the hook and bars at the very end. So that is how I'm going to show you how to do it. To finish the waistband lining layer, we're going to stitch in the ditch along the bottom edge of the waistband. I'm going to pin the waistband lining in place from the right side of my garment. If you wish to, you can baste along the bottom edge of your waistband to secure the waistband lining in place before sewing your stitch in the ditch. Here's how it looks from the inside. You can see how there's plenty of room to catch the waistband lining. With the right side of your waistband facing up, stitch in the ditch along the bottom edge of your waistband to secure your waistband lining in place. The following steps are for views with a waist facing. Those views are D, E, or F. You're going to bring your two back waist facing pieces together, right sides facing, along the center back edge, which is the double notch edge. So bring those two edges together, right sides facing, and pin. You're going to sew along the center back edge with a 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Press your seam allowances open. Take your left waist facing with extension and bring it to your back waist facing, right sides together, and match the single notch along the side seam. Make sure that your back waist facing is curved upwards and looks like a smiley face. So with it smiley face side up, pin your edges together. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Press your seam allowance open. Bring your right waist facing to the other end of your back waist facing. With right sides together, match the single notch, pin the layers together. Sew your right waist facing and back waist facing together along the side seam using 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Press your seam allowance open. I'm going to finish the bottom edge with a Hong Kong seam finish. So I'm going to bring the right side of my bias tape to the bottom edge of my waist facing, and I'm going to pin it in place. Right sides are together, so right side of my bias tape is facing the right side of my self fabric. The bottom edge of your waist facing is the bottom edge of the waist facing when it looks like a smiley face. If you wish to finish your waist facing with a serger or with your regular home machine, then you simply just finish the edge at the bottom where I'm pinning and move on to the next step. Sew your bias tape in place with a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Trim down your seam allowance to about 1/2. So I'm removing about 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters. Press your bias tape down away from your waist facing. Now flip your waist facing to be right side facing down, and you're going to fold the bias tape up and over the seam allowance and press it in place. With the right side of your waist facing face up, you're going to stitch in the ditch along the bias tape seam. Bring your waist facing right sides together to the top edge of your pants. You're going to want to start at the center back seam. So match the center back seam of your waist facing to the center back seam of your pants. Working your way around from the center back, pin your waist facing to your pant legs. Match the side seam of your waist facing to the side seam of your legs. When you get to the right center front edge, you're going to flip your fly piece around to the front of your leg, including the seam allowance. This edge stitch is going to force the seam allowance to come around to the front with the rest of the fly piece. That's correct. You want the seam allowance to be on top now. So keep that folded towards the front edge like this, and bring your waist facing piece on top. Your waist facing piece is purposely shorter than the entire length of your right front waist edge. So it should end shorter than the very front edge here. Now pin that in place. And pin the seam allowance in place as well. Now continue working your way from the center back edge towards the left center front. Match the side seam of your waist facing with the side seam of your legs. When you get to the left center front edge where your zipper shield is, your waist facing is going to be 1/2 inch longer in length. Just fold back that extra length and pin it in place. Starting at one of your center front edges, you're going to sew along your top edge of your waist facing with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. At the right center front edge, make sure that you sew all the way up until the edge, even though the waist facing ends. Grade your seam allowance by trimming away the waist facing. Now press the seam allowance up towards your waist facing, away from the pant legs. With the right side of your waist facing and pant leg facing up, you're going to sew an understitch along the top waist facing seam. Nicely fold the corner of your fly piece by folding under the seam allowance, and then carefully folding the fly piece back around to the inside. Now press your waist facing towards the inside of your garment. The understitch will force the seam to be slightly towards the inside, so that the outside looks super clean. Fold the left center front edge of your waist facing to line up behind your zipper shield, and press in place. You can either choose to sew this seam with a ladder stitch, or you can do a little top stitch detail, which I'm going to show you. Starting at the bottom where your waist facing is. So an edge stitch along the center front edge. And when you get to the top, pivot your needle and sew a couple stitches in. And then sew a vertical line parallel to your first edge stitch. And then pivot your needle again and finish your box. Using your paper pattern piece, which is the number 5 fly pattern piece, draw in your seam allowance and then cut around the curved edge just until the center front seam allowance. You can cut it completely off, but I like to save it for later and then just tape it back into place to set aside for another time. So using this as your guide and folding back the seam allowance along the center front edge and the top edge, you're going to draw in your fly curve. So use your marking tool and just draw along the edge. You're going to want to pin the shield out of the way so that you can do a top stitch line along your fly curve. You may choose to pin your fly piece in place as well. Pin it from the top though, because you're going to top stitch from the right side of your fabric. If you have been using top stitching thread for other areas of your pants, you may wish to switch your thread to a top stitching thread now to finish the fly detail. So I've put a top stitch thread in the top needle and kept my regular thread in the bobbin, and I switched my stitch length to a 3.5. And now, without anything else underneath, I'm going to sew with the right side facing up along the line I drew to secure my fly in place. Unpin your zipper shield and put it back in place. And this little corner down here, where it overlaps with the stitch line, that's where we're going to sew the zipper shield in place. So you can kind of feel it through your fabric. So it's just this little corner. I'm just gonna do 2 or 3 stitches back and forth. You can do a bar tack if you prefer. Either pin or baste the side seam of your legs to the side seam of your waist facing from the right side. Then you're going to stitch in the ditch of your side seam from the right side to secure your waist facing in place. Repeat that same process with the center back seam. And repeat this process one last time for your other side seam. You may wish to add a hook and bar to the front fly zipper area of your pants. To do so, you're going to put your hook on the top layer. There's not so much room next to the zipper, so try and just fit it as close as possible. This is approximately 1/8 of an inch down and 1/8 of an inch in from the edge, or 3 millimeters down and 3 millimeters in. I like to go into each hole 2 times, 2 or 3 times. It's like sewing a button. And you can see I'm not sewing through the outer layer at all, just through the waist facing layer or the inside fly piece layer. And now to mark the bar, I'm gonna feed the bar into the hook and zip my zipper all the way, and it should land just outside of the edge stitch. And you can't see any of those stitch lines from the inside. For the waistband views, which are views A, B, and C, we are going to sew on our hook and bars now. The waistband is 3 inches finished, or 7.6 centimeters in height. Mark 3/4 of an inch, or 19 millimeters, away from the top and the bottom. I'm going to align the hooks 1/4 of an inch, or 6 millimeters, in from the outermost edge. Sew on your hooks in the same manner you would sew on a button. You're going to go in and out of each hole 2 to 3 times. Take care to only sew through the waistband lining layer so that it's completely invisible from the outside. Repeat this method for your second hook. Now's a good time to try on your pants and double check the bar placement. If you want your waistband a little bit tighter or a little bit looser, you can decide that while you're wearing it. Use the hooks as your guide for where to place the bars. With your zipper closed and your center front making a straight line, see where your hooks hit on the under layer of your waistband. Mark as the position for where you sew on your bars. Sew on your bars in the same manner as you sewed on your hooks. Go in and out of each hole 2 to 3 times. And there you go. Now is a good time to give your pants another try on. You can determine how much you would like to hem it, or how little you would like to hem it. There is 2.5 inches or 6.3 centimeters built into the hem. If you would like to make the pants longer, do a smaller hem. If you would like to make the pants shorter, you can do a bigger hem, or you can trim off the excess. Press the hem 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters up. Going around one more time, fold your hem up 2 inches or 5 centimeters. Give your hem a press as you fold up the additional 2 inches or 5 centimeters. Pin your folded hem in place. Sew an edge stitch at the top edge of your hem. With your pants right side out, give your hem a final press. Hem your second leg in the same manner as your first leg. And you're all done! You've completed your Why'd You Do That trousers.